A British soldier dies training on the Brecon Beacons on the hottest day of the year. Josh Hall's death comes just 3 years after SAS trainees died of heat exhaustion on the same Welsh mountains. Also this lunchtime. Theresa May holds her own at her first Prime Minister's questions.
In my years here in this House, I've long heard the Labour Party asking what the Conservative Party does for women. Well, just keeps making us Prime Minister.
Dropped from your GP surgery for being too healthy. The NHS says it's carrying out necessary checks. Doctors call it disgraceful. And owning a piece of the legend for £3 million. Bowie's art collection goes under the hammer.
This is the ITV Lunchtime News with Charlene White.
Good afternoon. A soldier has died while training in the Brecon Beacons on the hottest day of the year. 26-year-old Joshua Hall, who's from Lockerbie in Scotland, was serving in the Rifles Regiment. He was due to get married later this year. It comes just 3 years after soldiers died during an SAS selection exercise on the same mountains. That led to a scathing report into the lack of protection offered to troops. Our correspondent Juliet Bremner reports.
Corporal Joshua Hall was on a gruelling march on the hottest day of the year when he collapsed. The 26-year-old from the Rifles Regiment was preparing for a course which would have given him promotion to the rank of sergeant. He died shortly after being taken back to the infantry training barracks at Derring Lines. The police released a statement saying Dyfed Powys Police is investigating the circumstances surrounding the death of a male soldier that occurred on the Brecon Beacons yesterday morning. Police are working closely with the Ministry of Defence in relation to this sudden death. Joshua was believed to have been on a march around the barracks, carrying a heavy backpack in temperatures that were over 30 degrees. His stepmother wrote, "Rest easy, soldier, my beautiful stepson. Can't believe it. Will always love you. So very proud of you. Thoughts with your family and fiancé." The tragedy comes 3 years after the deaths of 3 other soldiers on the same area of the Brecon Beacons on another very hot summer's day. They died from heat exhaustion during an SAS selection course. At their inquest, the Ministry of Defence was said to have made a catalogue of very serious mistakes. Today, there were more questions for the Army.
We'll be going back and calling the Ministry of Defence in and saying, OK, what have you done? How much of our recommendations have you implemented? Did you learn the lessons? How did this happen on yet again the hottest day of the year?
After the deaths in 2013, the Army did make changes. There are now cooling stations where soldiers can get refreshments and medical help. But these courses remain intentionally, physically and mentally challenging. Juliet Bremner, ITV News.
Our Wales correspondent Rupert Evelyn is there for us. Rupert, you know the area well because you covered those deaths 3 years ago. But it seems as though here we go again.
It's very troubling, isn't it, to be back in the same area talking about the warmest, hottest day of the year and talking about the death of a British soldier. You know, I sat through many, many days of those SAS inquests and repeatedly heard evidence of procedures and protocols not being followed by the MOD, by soldiers in effect being failed by their employer. Now, to be clear, we don't yet know exactly why Josh Hall died. Post-mortem will establish that precisely in due course. But there are very worrying parallels indeed, and there will be very serious questions being asked, not just on the ground level here in the Brecon Beacons, but arguably more importantly in Westminster, in the Ministry of Defence, to establish whether or not lessons have really been learned.
Rupert, thank you. You'd have had to look long and hard to spot any nerves when Theresa May took on her first Prime Minister's questions this lunchtime. She used her debut to tear into the Labour Party and its leader, Jeremy Corbyn. She suggested her opponents will spend the next few months ripping apart themselves while she puts the country back together. But Mr Corbyn fought back, accusing the government of a failed economic plan. Our political correspondent, Libby Vina, was watching.
Not for 26 years had a woman left through this famous door to face questions from MPs as Prime Minister. So the stakes were high. Mrs May loudly cheered as she entered the Commons, didn't disappoint. Jeremy Corbyn clearly hadn't bargained for what was coming when he said this.
Can I welcome the Right Honourable Member to her first Prime Minister's question time and congratulate her on her appointment and becoming the country's second woman Prime Minister?
Can I say to him, he refers to me as the second woman Prime Minister. In my years here in this House, I've long heard the Labour Party asking what the Conservative Party does for women. Well, just keeps making us Prime Minister.
But there was more, much more.
In her speech on the steps of Downing Street, she also addressed insecure workers, saying you have a job, but you don't always have job security.
I suspect that there are many members on the opposition benches who might be familiar with an unscrupulous boss. A boss who doesn't listen to his workers, a boss who requires some of his workers to double their workload. A boss, and maybe even a boss who exploits the rules to further his own career. Remind him of anybody?
Ahead of a visit to Germany's Chancellor Merkel, she tried to sound positive about Europe and didn't rule out staying in the single market.
And I can absolutely confirm that, yes, the United Kingdom will leave the European Union, but the United Kingdom is not leaving Europe.
But at every opportunity, she turned her guns on Labour.
And can I wish her well in healing the country in the months and years to come? After all, it is she and her colleagues who have so bitterly divided it.
Can I say the honourable gentleman makes a reference to divisions on the Conservative Party benches. No, I have to say, which is the party that took 3 weeks to decide which should be their unity candidate? It was the Labour Party that was sufficiently divided.
The unity candidate has now been agreed, but Labour won't have enjoyed today's masterly performance by Mrs May. Libby Vina, ITV News, Westminster.
I'm joined from Westminster by Isabel Hardman, the assistant editor of The Spectator magazine, who is watching the Prime Minister's performance. We've called it a masterly performance. Those are the words that have been used about it. What do you think?
Well, I have to say, I've always underestimated Theresa May. I was surprised that she would be running for Conservative leader and she's now Prime Minister. And I thought that she would give quite a dull performance at Prime Minister's questions. Whenever I'd seen her trying to make jokes before, she looked very uncomfortable. She's quite a serious person. And I thought that she'd changed the tone of PMQs. Now, she did, because she didn't have David Cameron's swagger. But what she did have was an incredibly calm authority that was incredibly surprising, given this wasn't just her first week in the job. She was expecting, if she had been made Tory leader, to be taking the job in September. So she's been thrust very quickly into doing Prime Minister's questions, and she didn't show that at all.
No, I mean, when you sort of look at what the commentators and stuff are saying online, I'd say that they do agree with you there, Isabel. But in terms of punchy one-liners, for example, David Cameron was well known for that. In fact, he got into trouble for saying "calm down, dear" to Angela Eagle way back when. Do you think we'll start seeing a lot more of those things from Theresa May, or she's going to do it her own way?
Well, she fitted her jokes very well. I think one of the problems with preparing for Prime Minister's questions is that you tend to have someone else writing your jokes, and that doesn't always work particularly well when you end up delivering them. Ed Miliband in particular had very funny jokes written for him that he was very bad at delivering. But one of the good things about Prime Minister's questions is it tests someone under pressure, and it sees what they're like when they lose their temper. And we saw that with David Cameron repeatedly when he lost his temper. Now, she's had a good first PMQs, but there'll be far more difficult ones in future, particularly with her own backbenchers putting pressure on her. So when she does eventually lose her temper, that will tell us a lot about Theresa May.
The Debating Society, of course, she was a part of the Debating Society at university and did some at school as well. You could really see that shine through, especially when we talk about confidence and resilience and being able to banter, essentially, really.
but also she's been Home Secretary and has had to deal with very difficult urgent questions and departmental question times in the Commons. It's probably the best preparation for the pressure and the heat of Prime Minister's questions that you can get outside of that unique session in the Commons. And she didn't look frightened, which lots of people do. And every Prime Minister says that they have a pit of fear in their stomach as they approach PMQs. Well, I'm sure she did privately, but she certainly didn't show it.
Well, Isabel, thank you so much for talking to us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Patients in England who haven't had any contact with their GP for 5 years face being cut from their doctor's surgery under plans being rolled out across the country. It's hopes the initiative will save the NHS hundreds of thousands of pounds in payouts. Sangeeta Kandola reports.
Surgery, good morning.
The patient list at this doctor's surgery in Kent, like most up and down the country, is full to capacity. But there is a growing number of so-called ghost patients, people on the list who haven't seen their GP for years. NHS England want to find out if these people no longer require the service. They say it's part of a cost-effective drive, as GP surgeries receive an average of £136 per registered patient, whether they see a doctor or not.
I think it's an unwelcome and unwise move, and I'm afraid it's motivated by an attempt to defund and remove funding from general practice, which will harm patient care.
So how will it work? The checks will affect patients who haven't been in contact with their GP for 5 years. They'll be sent 2 letters asking for a response. If they fail to reply to either, they face being taken off the practice list. But critics say key groups, including the vulnerable and elderly, who may not understand or check their post, could lose access to a doctor, leaving many at risk of vital health checks.
I think it's a little bit mean, to be fair. I think it's sort of penalising them for not using the NHS rather than, not overusing the services.
I don't think the doctors should get paid for patients if they haven't seen them for 5 years, because they could have moved away, they could have gone abroad, and they're getting paid for nothing, aren't they then?
NHS England plans to introduce the deregistration scheme at all GP surgeries across England after a trial. Sangeeta Kandola, ITV News.
Still to come. Could pre-prepared food be better than a homemade meal? Scientists make some surprising findings. And Bowie's Heroes, the masterpieces that inspire the musician to go on display for the first time. But first, extraordinary scenes in America where Donald Trump has been formally named as the Republican Party's nominee for president. Last night, the billionaire's children were among those who took to the stage in Cleveland to endorse him. But it was a speech by the New Jersey Governor Chris Christie which incited the crowd. They ended up chanting for Hillary Clinton to be jailed. Our Washington correspondent Robert Moore was there.
The next president of the United States, Mr. Donald J. Trump.
It is one of the great moments of theatre in American politics, clinching a presidential nomination.
The great state of Alabama, Arizona,
Mississippi,
Maryland,
California!
Republican delegates in all states and US territories involved in the roll call.
2 votes abstain.
Only a few defiant voices are left, complaining that Trump has hijacked the rules and the party that they love.
It's an embarrassment. I feel embarrassed to be an American right now. I've never said that before in my life.
89 delegates.
Appropriately for the Manhattan billionaire, it was the New York delegation.
Congratulations, Dad, we love you!
That technically put Trump over the threshold needed. So the insurrection is over. Trump has formally seized control and in the process utterly changed the direction and the very character of one of America's great political parties. And it felt like an American dynasty was born here. Not only was Donald Trump beamed in by video link to accept the prize,
we're going to win the presidency and bring real change and leadership back to Washington.
But then his daughter took to the stage.
In person, my father is so friendly, so considerate, so funny, and so real.
And then it was the turn of Donald Trump Jr., declaring that his father would change America.
And when we elect
election will have done all that. Will have made America great again, greater than ever before.
In Libya and Nigeria, guilty.
Republicans are in a vindictive political mood. The governor of New Jersey, a former prosecutor, conducting a mock trial of Hillary Clinton.
Is Hillary Clinton guilty or not guilty?
It wasn't just that the delegates shouted guilty. These are Republican activists demanding Clinton's imprisonment. Lock her up, they chanted. This is a party changing its very identity before our eyes. Robert Moore, ITV News, Cleveland.
Cross-Channel ferry passengers are facing waits of up to 3 hours to get through passport controls amid heightened French security checks following last week's terror attack in Nice. Travellers passing through the port of Dover in Kent are being told to allow plenty of time for their journey and prepare for heavy queues. Working parents are struggling to find suitable childcare during the school holidays, with high costs and a shortage of places putting families under pressure. Research by the Family and Childcare Trust shows parents spend about £120 a week per child. Now, we've always been told that healthiest meals are made at home, but could packaged food actually be better for young children? A new study thinks it may well be. Researchers from the universities of Aberdeen and Warwick found supermarket meals had less salt, only a third of the saturated fat, and less sugar. But home-cooked recipes had more nutrients, more vegetables, and were more cost-effective. So which to choose? We're joined by Paul Lindley, the founder of organic baby food Ella's Kitchen, and nutritionist Charlotte Sterling-Reid. Thank you both for joining us. I'll start with you first, Charlotte. Are they wrong or right, in your opinion?
I think there's certainly something that's correct there, and there's also some things that maybe they haven't quite highlighted enough. So, for example, the home-cooked meal that they're talking about, they're very much based on recipe books, not necessarily what parents are feeding their children at home. So I think that we need to take that into account. But absolutely, there are pros and cons of both, and I don't think it's about one or the other. Yeah. There's a place for both in the child's diet.
Well, considering you're with Ella's Kitchen, Paul, would you ever suggest to anyone that their child's diet should solely be what you offer at Ella's
We'd
Kitchen?
never say that. Absolutely. I think this report shows that both homemade food and shop-bought food can be trusted. Both of them provide the right density of calories, the right nutrition to have a balanced diet for young children. What I think is interesting is it's easy to think there's people who buy shop-bought and there's people who home cook, but in reality, most of us do both all the time. So between
a lot of people don't always do both.
Most people, 70-something% of all baby food that's eaten is actually homemade, and most people cook homemade food. But what I think shop-bought food can bring is a comfort and an assurity that, you know, brands like ours can only use the highest grade fruit and vegetables, it's baby grade stuff. And there's a regulation, there's a whole regulation that we're bound by, which ensure that there's a minimum amount of proteins and fats, and there's a maximum amount of
And I know we've got some of your stuff here that you know, a lot of the kids do eat, but what's a point that Charlotte does bring up, a lot of it's to do with cookbooks as well. Ella's Kitchen does have one. Yeah. So within the books, do you encourage people to do that balanced meal? Do you guide them in terms of what their kids shouldn't be eating, and of how much they should be having?
Absolutely. Our whole mission is to improve children's lives by helping them have a healthier relationship with food. That involves knowing how to cook food. So I think there's a place for both. Homemade, where kids learn where food comes from, how to cook it, and they're more likely to eat it if they've been involved themselves. So we've got these cookbooks. We've also got our foods which are more convenient and which often have more variety than people
could argue, and Charlotte, you may well be in this camp, is having this fresh fruit here perhaps is preferable to having the squeezed version that's in that. Would you agree?
Well, I think it's really important that children learn about food and where it comes from and what it looks like. But as Paul's suggesting as well, it's really about a variety. It's about both. The packet foods can be really useful for convenience, but it is so important for parents to also introduce children to what we would refer to as family foods and the flavours and the taste that family are used to, as well as real food, so they can see what it looks like. But again, it's a bit of a mixture.
All right. Well, Charlotte and Paul, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And finally, David Bowie was always about more than just his music. Throughout his life, he also painted works of art and bought a collection to rival the best in the world. Well, now 30 pieces that he privately owned have gone on display in London as his family prepares to auction them off. Nazanin Mashiri has been to have a look.
He was one of the most inventive artists of all time. We all know about David Bowie's passion for music and fashion, but what we don't know is about the fact that he spent most of his career collecting iconic pieces of art, mainly 20th century British artists, including Peter Lanyon, who painted this Witness from 1961, expected to fetch between £250,000 and £350,000. Also, landscapes by John Virtue. Now, joining us now is George Underwood, who was a childhood friend and also painter yourself, George. We're standing in front of Damien Hirst from the 1990s, a good friend of David Bowie. Do you think that the artwork he collected inspired his music?
I do. I definitely think that the thing also works the other way around, so that when I'm painting I listen to music and get inspired by that. And I'm sure David, when he was looking at, for instance, I'm looking now at that Bomberg over there, and I can see that David could easily sit down on the piano and using that as his starting point for a song or something like that. It makes sense when I look around and I see the amazing things he's collected. It's really good.
And David Bowie was a painter himself. Would you describe him as a successful one?
Well, he was a part-time painter. I think he'll admit that, and I know that he enjoyed doing it, but I don't think he had, should we say, the passion that he had for music.
George, thank you so much. Enjoy the
You're
collection.
Welcome. Thank you.
Well, David Bowie's family says that some of the more personal pieces will be kept by them, but this auction, which happens in November, gives the members of the public a chance to admire and, of course, acquire some of the pieces that David Bowie fell in love with.
Nazanin Mashiri there. Well, that's it this lunchtime. I'll be back alongside Mark Austin with the ITV Evening News at 6:30. The News Where You Are follows the national weather, but from everyone here, enjoy your afternoon. Goodbye.